This is Tyler, your antisocial critic and the host of the AntiSocial Network, your number one source for anachronistic conversations online. Come join us each week to hear opinions from some of the best voices discussing entertainment, politics, religion, and modern life on the internet today, most of which you've never heard of, but I have. This week we're joined by Arlie Coles. She's a researcher, a linguist, and a practicing Anglican from Quebec, and a fellow member of the Spencer Clavens Locals community. How's it going today?
It's going pretty well. Although I gotta correct you on one thing. I'm not from Quebec. I'm actually from great state of Texas.
Really? Okay, because
I am.
I was under the impression you were Canadian, so...
I'm not Canadian. I did spend a lot of time in Canada. I went to university there and then grad school there. So I've still got a lot of ties there, so it's a reasonable mistake to make.
All right. I would consider it a horrible slander to be mistaken from Canada, so I apologize up front for that horrible mistake on my part. But yeah, so kind of explain what kind of research and work you do. I usually just say you're a scientist of some sort. But I never really understand what you're tweeting about most of the time because.
Sure. So I work in AI, which is a rapidly growing space, but I think it's also a really poorly understood space. So that's totally understandable. Specifically, I work in the area of deep learning, which is a specific type of AI. And I work specifically within that specific type, specifically on stuff for speech. So human language processing, natural language processing. This is a wide area of application in industry right now. There's a lot of technology that is kind of at everybody's fingertips for treatment of either speech, like a speech signal, or text, like what you would find online, predictive text in your phone, speech-to-text services, this type of thing. Widely growing market, and my subfield of AI has a lot of specific applications to this area. So the background is in linguistics, but computer science also comes in really strong on that, and kind of puts those things together into one package.
How did you wind up doing that?
A long series of trying things until I found something that I liked enough. So I knew I really enjoyed languages and language learning and that type of thing. And I became really interested when I was younger, in high school, about how people learn languages, how languages are structured, this type of thing. And so this is what linguists study, among other things. They study the internal structure of language. It's not so much about the any one specific language, but more like what does human language as a faculty have that defines it, that makes it work. And there actually is a natural intersection here between that and computer science. When you think about what you're doing when you're programming a computer, you're giving it a set of instructions that have to be formatted in a certain way. They have to have a certain syntax, certain ideas have to be respected. So there's a big overlap in what computer science can teach us about language and what language can teach us about computer science. So the deeper that I kind of pursued that intersection in school, in my undergrad work, the writing was on the wall to take that into the AI space. The machine learning, deep learning space really has made a lot of advances pretty recently with regard to speech and language in particular. So right place, right time, was the correct intersection of what I was really interested in, and it's just a field that's totally taken off now.
You're right on the cutting edge. I mean, it seems like every technology now, in some regard, has to be able to recognize speech in order to function. And I mean, even up until really recently, it was hard to actually make most of that technology actually kind of work, at least from a user endpoint standpoint, because so much of the technology doesn't really understand context. So if you ask a very long technical question to Siri or to your Amazon device or your Google device, it's gonna come back with, "I don't understand any of this." And nowadays it's getting better, so.
It's getting much better, and you may have noticed if a lot of people are early adopters for this type of thing. If you've been an early adopter, you will have noticed that between, there's like a breaking point, pretty much before 2017 or so, and after 2017 or so. There's actually been some brand new technology, some brand new models that were just invented that have made things really take a leap in terms of how long of a context you can remember, what you can make sense of. We could get into the details on that. But if you've noticed, like a hockey stick shape improvement, that's not your imagination. It's really come up quite fast.
Well, it's all technology in general right now. There's so much refinement going on that things that were rudimentary 20 years ago are now commonplace and are just apps. Like everything is getting smaller and more condensed to the point where things that you needed 10 devices to do 20 years ago, now you can all do on this. And this is
that's right.
Filled with redundancies that you absolutely should not be using at all times. So
That's right. And you raise a good point. I mean, hardware has really taken us really far in a really short amount of time. There's this thing called Moore's Law. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but it's kind of a thing in computer science circles that your computational power increases.
Every 18 months.
Yeah, something like that. I don't remember the exact formulation of it, but the intuition of it is right. The biggest steps you can get are usually hardware first. And we've had really big hardware improvements in a short amount of time. And in fact, a lot of the techniques that are used, we're in the weeds now, but a lot of the techniques that are used for what makes modern machine learning so successful, they're really old. Some of them are as old as Newton. Newton's method of descending gradients properly, or with higher order derivatives is really what's going on. Neither here nor there, but these things are very old. The only thing new about a lot of them, more of them come from the 60s, the 1960s.
I was going to say none of this has to do anything to do with Anglicanism, but I would agree. I mean,
exciting.
One of the little quiet little secrets about technologies is that a lot of the technologies that are getting democratized right now have technically existed since the 1970s in some regard. Like the big one I always go to is 3D printing, which has existed for a very long time and only just became commercially available within the last decade, and now it's everywhere.
Right.
Anyone can do it in their garage.
It's a similar story. Yep, it's a similar story here. The hardware, the ideas have been around, but just now we have the hardware to do it. And once you get the hardware in place, you've got people thinking about the software, people thinking about the abstract models to create, and then kind of before you know it, you're in a situation where you have too many toys and you don't really know the ethics about how to use them, and then you get into this big tech controversy every 5 seconds because human beings always build the toy first and then they come afterward and decide how to properly use the toy.
Yeah, so, one of my other regular guests is an AI ethicist, and he's going to come on next week. So I may have to ask him a little bit more about how that works for him, but because I never actually talked to him about how he does his job, but he's spent so much of his time online arguing about philosophy and religion that I guess he's a little bit too preoccupied. Doesn't want to take his job home to Twitter.
Understandable.
So, like I briefly alluded to, part of the reason why I wanted to have you on specifically was because you've been kind of very helpful on the locals page of answering a lot of my philosophy questions, including a very long, thoughtful post about explaining your Anglican faith to me, and when I was trying to figure out, when I'm kind of going through it, because like I mentioned before, we were talking earlier, this is essentially part 2 in my series called Christianity at the Crossroads, where I want to have pointed conversations with people from different faiths. And Anglicanism is an interesting one to me because it's one I'm familiar with in passing, because it's the religion that a lot of the notable intellectuals of the 20th century have embraced, be it your C.S. Lewis's, your T.S. Eliot's, but doesn't seem to be that widely embraced in the United States. And so my understanding of it is somewhat limited to what I've kind of caught in passing. I was just reading Gene Weiss' book on Lutheranism about a month ago, and he kind of mentions that spiritually it's kind of that Anglicanism is kind of the opposite of Lutheranism in some respects, and that Lutheranism is strict, loose, very liberal liturgy, but very strict theology, whereas Anglicanism is very loose theology and very strict liturgy. So could you kind of go into how would you define Anglicanism as a sect?
Sure. Yeah, big question. It's interesting that comparison with Lutheranism. I mean, what you get in the Lutheran case and in the historical reformational case, what ended up happening at that Reformation was a specific set of theological ideas, or at least a specific set of theological excesses that were identified by that movement, right? So at the base of that movement was theology, right? Whereas you will see in Anglicanism a wide tent of theological opinion that it does not mean a free-for-all. There are limits, right? But, despite what some may caricature Anglicanism as, there are limits. But that is not the historical reason for our existing. So there's a lot of ways to identify Anglicanism, but maybe one thing that I could just, put out the way at the beginning. There's a lot of people who will make a comment like, well, isn't the Church of England just existing because Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and so that's why the beliefs are all over the place, or such and such thing. And that's a fair question. I mean, historically, yes, indeed, that the Church of England was started by the fact that Henry VIII wanted a divorce in order for him to be able to produce a male heir, went through a series of wives before this happened, and that on its face is a political situation. That is true. But people who get caught on that, I think that they are applying the Lutheran idea of how a church ought to start. No Anglican today, I would venture to say, has it as a deep-held tenet that, Henry VIII should have asked for a divorce because of such and such theological reason. Every Anglican recognizes that it's a political reason. So it's kind of a category mistake to ask, well, how can you justify that theologically? It's like, well, that wasn't we weren't started on something theological to begin with. I mean, that's just a fact, But beyond that, I think what you get in the Anglican tradition, because it was not started specifically on theological principles, that does not mean that it is divorced of a theological character. And what you actually had at the very beginning of the English Reformation at that time were a lot of people who were waiting in the wings, who were influenced by the Continental Reformers to begin with. You had people he wasn't influencing at this time, but you have William Tyndale, who was one of the first people to put the Bible in the vernacular English at the time. This came from a reformational impulse that things ought to be in the vernacular language for the everyday people to be able to read. That preceded the issue with Henry VIII. You also have the first Archbishop of Canterbury after the split from Henry. Thomas Cranmer, who is responsible for assembling the Book of Common Prayer, which is the standard for Anglican practice even today. All of these people had strong reformational impulses theologically, but because the split that Henry began was not really theologically motivated, there's no confessional character of Anglicanism at that time that is brought about by those Continental Reformers. What you get instead is the Continental Reformers taking an opportunity here, taking an opportunity there to kind of push their agenda where it was politically tenable to do so. You get some people who really wanted to hold on to the Catholic character of the church at that time. Henry VIII was one of them, by the way. He hated Luther. At the beginning, he wrote against Luther. He wrote in defense of the Seven Sacraments, and actually got a title from the Pope of Defender of the Faith, which, by the way, the head of the English monarchy retains that title today, even though they're not Roman Catholic anymore. Henry was not a fan. He split for reasons that were not theological. He actually held quite tightly to Catholic theology whenever he could, and the real reforms did not take place until after his death. But just to recap, we don't have such a strong confessional character. It's not like the Lutheran tradition or the Genevan traditions, where you have catechisms that stand alongside the Bible or alongside the Bible and the creeds or things like this. You don't have that in Anglicanism because it wasn't intended to be that in the first place. You do get this big tent situation because you've got the Protestants who in the end want to kind of advance their agenda in any little opportunity that comes up to do that. And that takes a long time to play out. We have this cycle of English monarchs that go through. Henry dies, Edward ascends, and things are very Protestant under Edward. Edward goes, and Mary ascends, Bloody Mary, right, who is Catholic. England realigns itself with Catholicism at that time. A lot of Protestants are persecuted at that time. Mary goes, and Elizabeth comes, and then you have more Catholic influence again. You have this historical push and pull that comes out of the fact that church was not founded on confessional principles per se, It just means that you do get the push and pull. You do end up being sort of a via media, and that's another buzzword that Anglicans like to use, that the middle way between some of the extremes. It wasn't on purpose, but it did. One could make the case that it's providential, right? There is some mediating force there that I think is a strong characteristic even of modern Anglicanism. We've really retained a lot of that character of try to be the middle way. There's going to be things on either side of that middle way, but those are not essential things. Does that maybe give a good start?
Yeah, I mean,
very complicated history.
Middle way churches don't.
I should footnote, I'm not a historian. I don't have any authority to speak on that per se, but just as a reference of how Anglicans see that, they don't identify with Henry VIII. They may not even identify with the reformers that were whispering in Henry VIII's ear. But yeah, go on.
No, this is a good start. I mean, middle way religions don't tend to be very popular nowadays. I mean, Lutheranism kind of does that too, where it tries to find the liturgical point between Catholicism and Protestantism. That's kind of the best of both worlds, and in doing so, it tends to make a lot of both of them very, very angry. And I get the sense that Anglicanism is kind of the other side of the coin from Lutheranism, then, in terms of how it approaches that. Like Vieth says in his book, it's and like you're saying, it's got a lot of the Catholic flavor without necessarily being Catholic. But how do you? What am I trying to ask specifically? Do you think that do you think that origin does bother Anglicans at all? Then, or I assume you said a little bit it does, but do you think that because nowadays so much of the claims for being the one true church come in their claims to being founded in the right way. Like, I know so many Catholics online, they're like, I'm founded, our church was founded literally by Paul or Peter, and we have a strict lineage that goes all the way back then, and Protestants will always say, like, our beliefs are the foundational beliefs of the church fathers, and they're not corrupted by the Catholics. Like,
right, and everybody else is wrong in some way, and then they have different ways of reconciling what it means to be wrong, and so I know there's kind of a gag that happens on Twitter all the time and on Christian internet circles all the time that there's no salvation outside the church, and the church is my church specifically,
submit to Canterbury.
Right. I mean, there's no. I would not. That's a bit, right? Like, whoever's saying that is saying
I know
that
it's a bit,
or they're wrong.
I just if you saw my immediate comment, I just wrote when you're not a Baptist and you haven't submitted to Nashville, and it just shows Squidward burning in hell.
Yeah, unfortunate, No, but that is something that I think defines us as well, is that we don't conceive of the church that way. And that's not to disparage those that do. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church definitely sees itself as the one true church exclusively, in the sense that anything outside of that is outside of the church. Anglicans don't usually see themselves that way. They see themselves as a branch of the whole church, of the Catholic Church. And I use Catholic in the little c sense, right? Catholic meaning universal. So at the time of Jesus and the apostles, there was a church, right? In the sense that they were together, they believed, they had to work through what they believed, but they were unsplit per se. The first schism doesn't happen until between the what is now the Eastern Orthodox and what is now the Roman Catholics for quite some time. And so the idea is, schism is a reality. There's no putting that genie back in the bottle without some serious help. And so where we are now is a branch of the whole church. We don't consider ourselves exclusively the church. So I think there's a lot of comfort in Anglican circles. Like, there's nobody who would seriously say that anybody who's outside of Anglicanism is outside of the church just because they're outside of Anglicanism. That's not the conception that Anglicans have. That's not their ecclesiology. In fact, one thing that also does define the Anglican tradition is its historical episcopacy. And so you may hear us talk about this. We do talk about the line of bishops, where each bishop received his bishopness at the hands of another, actually several others, but there's a straight line of bishops, right, that you can trace supposedly back to the time of the apostles. And the Anglican tradition has historically cared about this a lot. The reason we cared about this historically a lot was because of our Catholic roots specifically. Where a lot of the other offshoots of the Reformation went to a more Presbyterian type of polity, where each church has a presbyter and they may interact with each other in certain ways. We have bishops, and those bishops actually form a line. I think Lutheranism has bishops as well, but they don't have the succession. They don't have apostolic succession of those bishops back, all the way back. And whether this is important to you or not is a point of contention among different Protestant groups.
Yeah, I mean,
Anglicans do make the claim.
Yeah, and when the Lutheran church I go to is part of the Missouri Synod, which means they don't respect any of the actual official Lutheran organizations outside of the Midwest, because they essentially believe that all the larger Lutheran organization has been corrupted, so that they basically just resorted to the most conservative reading of liturgy and biblical inerrancy humanly possible, and it's certainly an interesting approach. Although they definitely don't care about the lineage at all. Although speaking of epistemology, I'm mixing up a whole bunch of words right now. But yes, I was actually gifted a copy of the Book of Common Prayer through a very unusual means. So, and this might be a good jumping off point to talk about your work with that specifically. But I work with a local homeless charity, and they give me old used Bibles to give away, and for some reason this was tucked in there. So I took it because I really couldn't give it away to like just some homeless person on the street. But could you talk a little about your work with the Book of Common Prayer, and what is it?
Sure. What is the Book of Common Prayer?
This one's Episcopalian, so I don't know if there's a huge difference, but
sure. So yeah, well, maybe it's a good idea to talk about what the Episcopal Church is too. The Episcopal Church is just the Anglican Church that exists in the United States historically. So Episcopal means with bishop. That's all it means. So when the American Revolution happened, the American Anglican people couldn't really retain the King of England as the administrative head of the church. That doesn't really work once you've declared it. So what happened was they formed instead something called the Episcopal Church. They called it the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States. Episcopal means with bishop. The defining characteristic is that we have the succession of bishops. So a fun fact is that, we couldn't really, again, we just fought that whole War of Independence thing. We couldn't really go back and ask the English bishops to please, consecrate some American ones, a little bit of bad blood there. So how did we maintain that line? We actually got the Scottish bishops to do it.
That's a brilliant move right there. There's a lot of bad blood with them, but they're happy to give us some.
Yes, exactly. So the Episcopal Church is the historical expression of the Anglican tradition in the United States. And so what's the difference between that and Anglican today? There's all sorts of people who believe that the Episcopal Church is on the wrong track and may have split off. This has happened many times throughout the history of the country, frankly. We call those continuing Anglicans. And they split many times over different issues over church history.
Do you consider yourself Episcopal or Anglican then, specifically?
It's a little complicated because of my history in Canada. So I was, I'm an American. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, but the Episcopal Church went through another one of these difficult periods when I was growing up. And so how that affected my family specifically is that we had to hop around to different parishes that were dealing with those controversies in different ways. Then I moved up to Canada for university, and obviously it's not called the Episcopal Church. It's just the Anglican Church in Canada, right? So they have their own, jurisdiction. They have their own bishops and so on. It's just the Canadian branch of that church where the Episcopal versus everybody else split is not as salient. But they're all Anglicans. They are all part of the worldwide Anglican tradition and body and all of that. So that being said, Book of Common Prayer.
Yes.
So you have an Episcopal copy. I imagine if that's an Episcopal copy, it's probably the 1979 edition, which is the last time that the prayer book was revised.
Let me look through the pages and see if I can give you an answer. Yep, September 1979. So.
Yeah. Okay. So this book has had several editions over history. but the spirit of the book has not changed. The overall structure and purpose of the book has not changed. Every time that the prayer book gets updated, there's always some type of controversy for people that want to change stuff and people that want to retain stuff. And, the theological weeds to get into here are many. But the bird's eye view is that this book is a foundational book for Anglican identity, for the Anglican tradition. It is a special book because it was really the first time that, first of all, that the liturgy at all was in English, period. And it was publishable for ordinary people to own. So after Henry's death, Thomas Cranmer, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury under the new Church of England, compiled this book. Some of it is his original composition. Some of it comes from the Roman rites that preceded the Church of England existing. Some of it comes from other Reformed sources. Some German sources are in there. Basically, what Thomas Cranmer did is he assembled all of these liturgical sources together to put them in English and put them in people's pockets, effectively. Now, whether you can afford it or not is another question. But
mine was free, so.
Yeah, so there you go. So if you take a look around in that book, you'll see that it's a liturgical book. It's the Book of Common Prayer. It's something that everyday people can use, first of all. Second of all of the ceremonies of the church are in there. So preceding a book like this, before a book like this existed, you'd have to have one missal for what happens at Holy Communion. You'd have to have other things for like funerals, marriages. Maybe you have that book, maybe you don't. If you're an ordinary person, you certainly don't. Only the clergy would have had that. Other things such as baptisms and morning and evening prayer, daily prayers in there. All of the stuff that forms the activity of the church is in there, and it is available to the everyday person in the vernacular language. So that is the big accomplishment of the Book of Common Prayer. So we take it for granted, but something like this just plainly did not exist. Did not exist before this book, especially in the English-speaking tradition.
It's funny, we talk about this now because just 2 weeks ago, the Pope just basically told the Catholic Church they're not allowed to do Latin Mass anymore without special permission. And we're sitting here talking about how much of a blessing this is. So
yeah, 500 years ago, and we've profited from that for 500 nearly 500 years since. So that book is quite important because of all of those philosophical reasons. It's also very important, even if you're not an Anglican or have nothing to do with Christianity even, because it is a source of many idioms, many expressions, many formulations that are now common to the English language. This was a landmark book for the development of English in the first place. So, any time that you go to a wedding or you see a wedding on TV, the wedding vows come from that book. Those come exclusively from that book. Anytime you hear the phrase, when you're digesting something, like a thought, or you read something and you think, I have to digest that. That's a phrase from the Book of Common Prayer. There's all sorts of idioms and fun expressions and stuff like this that come from that book. So even if you have nothing to do with Anglicanism, you should check out its influence on the language. Now, this book is still in use in the Anglican churches of today. In fact, the 1662 edition of that book, which is one of the first landmark editions, is actually still the version in force in the Church of England now. They actually haven't had an update that went through since then, because in that country it has to actually pass Parliament. I know for Americans that's weird.
Oh no. Good luck with that. But
yeah. So
what is your relationship with this then? Because I know you've been doing some projects online with the Book of Common Prayer.
Mm-hmm. So this book, where does it come from? I know I just mentioned a bunch of sources, but a very non-negligible source of information behind that text, behind that liturgical text, is the Bible. It is full of quotes, allusions, direct and indirect, that make that book a very useful resource for learning how to pray, for praying on a regular basis, and it justifies what the Anglican Church does, so that when people come to church and when people participate in the ceremonies of the church, they're actually participating in something that somebody didn't just make it up. It actually has a very strong biblical undergirding. So one project that I have done online, I've called it the Scriptural BCP, the Scriptural Book of Common Prayer. And so what this is, it's a website that you can look around. You can look around in the different ceremonies of the church, the different forms of prayer, and see all of the biblical references that are in those forms of prayer. So for people who may be coming from a more evangelical tradition, or a tradition that is more used to extemporaneous prayer, and that is maybe very skeptical of, well, where did this come from? And, didn't you just make that up? And, something like that can meet people on that level and say, these prayers are actually very full of scripture, and it's a gift that has been curated by the Anglican branch of the church. They don't claim to be the whole church, but we are the branch of the church that cultivates this particular tradition, and we find it very useful.
Okay, and I'll have to have you send me the link to. I know you sent it to me at some point, but I'll have to send it to me again so I can add it in the credits or there to this video. But how does what would be the best way to start reading it if you wanted to just kind of get a sense of what the contents are?
Sure. So what may be most familiar to people would just be the communion service. That would be your normal Sunday service. But for individual use, there is something that is called the daily office. And you'll see that that's actually at the front of that book. It'll contain morning and evening prayer. And so what this is, when Thomas Cranmer was putting this together, he was coming from, liturgically, he was coming from the Roman tradition that was there before the beginning of the Church of England. And in the Roman tradition, and even still today, what they do in the monasteries is that they pray many times a day. They pray the liturgical hours, the liturgy of the hours. And so normal people don't have time to do this. You cannot pray, 8 and 9 and 10 times a day with each service lasting 30 minutes. Monks do that. Ordinary lay people usually can't do that. But it means that lay people would be cut off from any prayer tradition that has developed around those monastic liturgical hours. So what Cranmer did when he was putting this book together is he said, one thing I want to do is I want to simplify those. I want to whittle them down and transmit that bit of tradition to the everyday person. So he combined some of the morning liturgical hours and some of the evening liturgical hours into what are now morning and evening prayer in that book. And so what you'll see is that this is something that can be prayed every day. You can pray just in the morning, you can pray just in the evening, you can pray both, you can do really whatever you please, but the resource is there and is something that is designed for lay people from the beginning, designed for lay people to be able to incorporate into their routine as they wish. So the morning and the evening prayer both share a general structure, and they are both derived from the original monastic hours that preceded the Church of England. So this is one example of the Catholic liturgical influence coming. It's a rich tradition. And the Protestant, let's put it in English and put it in the everyday person's hands influence as well. So I would recommend the daily office just as a easy starting point, if not just going to a Sunday service and seeing what the communion service is like. It will follow the Book of Common Prayer. You are able to follow it.
Sure. I thought about, I've been doing a lot of, as Protestants say, church shopping lately, just to kind of try to see what's around me. And unfortunately, my local Episcopalian church has been closed due to COVID for the past year and a half. Although I get the sense they may or may not ever open again, just because I don't think anyone there wants to. What's the right word? This might be a good kind of jumping point to jump into one of my general concerns with Episcopalianism in general. That being its propensity to kind of embrace modern politics. Do you ever? Sure. Do you know? I'm sure you notice this. Like, would you? And I think it happens in both the Anglicanism in England and in Episcopalianism here, where these two churches seem to be the ones that most seem to kind of capitulate to modern political whims more than anyone else.
Right. I mean, that definitely is observable, and you would not be wrong to say that we're not. To say that we are indeed currently in a phase where. Episcopalians, just like people who have left the Episcopal Church over concerns over some of these things, they are both kind of in a whirlwind of having to orient themselves around lots of elements of modern politics. Do you take something and assess it and see, we're not founded in a way that is confessional. It's not like you can hold it up to some catechism and say, well, does this fit? Yes or no. Each thing has to be taken and thought about and worked through. And so kind of a negative tendency, when you have a lot of freedom, you have a lot of responsibility. And so kind of a negative tendency on this front is to perhaps accept certain things for the wrong reasons, to put things that may be, that certainly ought not to be in front of the gospel. And I think many people in good faith have left the Episcopal Church for what they perceive to be problems of this nature. I'm choosing my words carefully here because there are just as many, I feel, in a lot of places who remain in the Episcopal Church who may have a different judgment call on some of these things, or who may have really worked through something and thought, okay, well, I've really worked through some element of something. I'm not just accepting it because it's the modern thing to do, but I'm accepting it because I think it's compatible with, such and such thing. But there's been a lot of turmoil in the Anglican world lately over some of these things. So without getting into that too much, because I think it is in the weeds, but how do you navigate this, and what is the principle that you can use, right? If you have the answer to that,
I don't have
a lot of the world's problems.
We can get a little into the weeds on this because I think there are a lot of interesting examples of it I've heard, especially in the last couple of years. When I had my buddy Ginger on a couple months ago, he talked about how there's a huge contingent of Anglican parishes and that have just moved wholesale reconverted to Catholicism because they want the traditional liturgy back, and they were very frustrated by the fact that the Anglican Church was essentially capitulating on all these political issues. And I see that all the time out in Chicago, where you drive around downtown and you see all these beautiful old school Episcopalian churches, and every single one of them has pride flags and political posters and everything. And you can completely tell that they're still functioning churches, but they're more political institutions than religious ones. And even like our mutual Bay Spencer, he talked about he almost joined the Anglican Church as a priest, and they basically said that if he wanted to be a member of the church, they would completely look the other way on his lifestyle choices, quote unquote. And he basically had the gumption to say, I'm not going to join a church where you're going to cover for my who I am and lie to the populace and say that and pretend like, oh, I'm not gay, but we're going to just look the other way on it and not make it like pretend like it's not a big deal. And so it seems like there's a lot of political turmoil ongoing right now.
Yeah, that is accurate. And I think the situation regarding that particular issue is a very, very live one. When I referred to things that were going on in that church at the time that I was growing up, or really coming of age in that church, that was definitely something that was tearing apart a lot of parishes, because you have people on one side of that issue who say, we see a legitimate reason to incorporate this into our liturgy or into something that we will openly accept, and you have the other side that says, no, I think that goes against my idea of biblical principles, or I think that's not really what God has in mind. These types of equally good faith arguments. But a lot of those things did get hijacked in a lot of ways, and in some places, worse than others, in terms of accepting things just for political purposes, rather than because we actually think that this should be accepted openly. So in Spencer's case, I think he was in England at the time, if I remember that story correctly.
Yeah, he was an Oxford graduate, so he was contemplating joining the Anglican Church in England. So
right. So I believe the status on that issue in England is that they do not bless homosexual marriages, I believe. And so, to me, and this is just my personal opinion, not trying to speak as a representative of anybody, to me, it would take a lot of integrity to say, like, you would have looked the other way, but the real problem is not that you would have accepted this or not accepted this. The real problem is that you say you don't, but behind closed doors you would have.
Yeah.
What you see in the Episcopal Church happening around this issue is more overt than that. It's more open. You do have people saying, no, we should bless gay marriages and things like this. But that means that we will openly affirm that, or we would openly say that is something that should be involved in the life of the church. So it wouldn't be saying one thing and doing another. In that case, you would just be saying what you believe. And at that point, some people can say, well, that isn't what we believe, and maybe I ought to go somewhere else in that case. And this was handled, not, in my opinion, not very well by actors, I would say, on both sides of this issue, and we are still indeed feeling the reverberations of this now. But just to kind of zoom out from this particular thing, because we're not in turmoil all the time, and we're not in turmoil on. I know it seems but we're not in turmoil on lots of things. There's lots of things where people do indeed line up, and so this is something that is important to me because I have kind of been split over the border. I've seen the state in the U.S. and I've seen the state in an Anglican parish that is not, or an Anglican branch of the Anglican Church that's not in the United States, and so I can kind of see. And what you want after a schism is always for the two sides to come back together. Schism is always sad. If you think that somebody is in error, you would like them to change their mind. What the danger is when you want them gone. And so people who fall on the other side of that issue need to currently take care, I think, to not demonize the heritage that they left, because I am a big proponent of the larger Anglican tradition. We have a very long and very rich history, and the institutions that brought those things to us are things that we should want to rebuild. So this is why I'm avoiding taking controversial positions here, because my ultimate goal really is to push for these things to get back together. Why do I care about the Book of Common Prayer? Because it is something that we all have in common, and it's something that has a long and rich history, and that really, really can do important things. We have all of these things in common, and frankly, as an Anglican, I believe that the Holy Spirit is at work in those institutions, in those things like the Book of Common Prayer, in the things like our Sunday liturgies, in the sacraments that we administer. All of those things are characteristic of our church, and even though there have been splits, because with that greater doctrinal freedom comes a lot of responsibility. There are going to be errors, and there are going to be reactions to errors, and humans sin. There is no schism that's free from those effects, and that goes for every schism that has ever happened. One thing that I really do appreciate about the Episcopal Church and even the Anglicans who have left it is that something that's common to our longer history is we are very ecumenical. And what I mean by that is not only by saying like, well, we're not the only branch of the church. We actually have had active efforts to do things with Roman Catholics, to do things with Eastern Orthodox, to do things with all of our brothers and sisters in other traditions. You may have heard, maybe this is now getting into the Anglican deep cuts, okay? But you may have heard of the Lambeth Quadrilateral. Have you heard of this before?
No, I haven't.
It's a statement that was put together. So Lambeth is this conference that happens every 10 years now for the worldwide Anglican Communion. So there's Anglican churches all over the world in their respective countries. The idea is every 10 years they send representatives to come to this conference, and the Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of this conference, first among equals. There's no submitting to Canterbury, it's just that somebody has to run the show. So, so in the 1800s, the conference, the Lambeth Conference, put out in response to the fact that that Britain specifically had a lot of colonies that it was having to manage, and that means you're going to have different expressions of church in all of those different places, and what do we do to maintain unity? Also, in response to the Oxford movement, which was a movement within Anglicanism for the resurgence of particularly Catholic-style piety, Catholic-style ritual, people who had affections for Rome. In response to these two things, they put out a statement at that year's Lambeth Conference called the Lambeth Quadrilateral, and it was kind of 4 things that we would want to see for ecumenical reunion. And I think this is something that could be useful for my particular communion now, for my particular, the state of the Anglican Church now. I think we can learn a lot from our own document in this Lambeth Quadrilateral. So 4 things, we faced this before, right? 4 things. One is the importance and sufficiency of Scripture, right? The Bible remains extremely important. Now, there's always a million questions about how to interpret the Bible and whose interpretation is right, but you cannot throw it out, right? That's one. And that's, my project with the Book of Common Prayer seeks to show that. We have historically cared deeply about the Bible. Two is the oh no, I did the thing where I said there's going to be four, and now I can't remember the four. Bible, creeds, okay? The Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed are the normative statements of faith. We don't have any other confession. These are core. You can believe other things in addition to them. You can't believe things that are contrary to them, and you can't force people to believe things that are exterior to them. The creeds really are the core. Okay, Bible, creeds, sacrament. Specifically, what's in this Lambeth Quadrilateral is reference to baptism and to the Eucharist. So these are the two dominical sacraments. These are important locuses of focus points of church life. The Anglican Church is a church that administers the sacraments, also important. And the last is I believe, the historical episcopacy, which is important to us, right? For reasons that have to do with the idea of tradition being passed on over a long time. So our valorization of bishops is not necessarily bishops as such. It's kind of a proxy for tradition being handed down as received, right? So these four things altogether constitute Anglican identity and should constitute, in the long run, Christian identity. We can reach out to other churches for this as well as patching up, patching up disagreements and sometimes very bitter schisms within our own church.
I don't want to dig too deep into the weeds, but I think we're already well past the point of not doing that. So, what is the Anglican Faith's official definition of the Eucharist? I've been talking with a lot of people online about this recently because it's been one of the foundational questions I'm asking as I'm going through different church traditions. Because I think, coming from an evangelical background where it's treated entirely as a traditional ceremony with no real sacramental value to it, at least in the sense that the way the Catholics believe, where you are literally partaking in the body and blood. What is the Anglican Church's stance on that?
Sure. So due to the way that we were founded, again with that pushing and pulling between the Catholic, really it's transubstantiation and that's it, and the Protestants who said no, it's some sort of memorial, right? Because you have that pushing and pulling, it's really hard to land somewhere on this in the historical sense. What has evolved over the history of Anglicanism is the doctrine, we'll call it the doctrine of real presence, big R, big P. So basically what this says is, and the stance of the church, what it says is, it is really the body and blood of Jesus. How? It's a mystery. You can try to parse it further if you like. You can. You have the whole range of potential opinions that you could have, in the sense of it could be, Roman Catholic style transubstantiation, in the sense that the substance of this thing has completely changed. It's no longer bread and wine. It is now the body and blood, right? And it happens at exactly this moment when the priest says exactly this particular prayer and so on, right? You could be on the other side that says, well, it's not just a memorial because it is the body and blood of Christ, but I don't think that the substance has actually changed. I think that maybe when I eat it, I am spiritually receiving the body and blood in some type of way. Christ is present in the Eucharist. How? It's a mystery. And so historically, what the formularies, what the liturgy has evolved into is something that allows you to read in your particular Eucharistic piety on that. So when we give communion, if you go up to the altar rail in an Anglican church to receive communion, the person that will give it to you will say, the body of Christ, right? So that's unambiguous. This in some way is the body of Christ, right? Take this, eat this, and feed on him in your heart by faith with thanksgiving. So you can have a field day with that, trying to parse what, feed on him. Okay, well, I'm feeding on him. So it's not a memorial of him. I'm feeding on him in some type of way. But I'm feeding on him in my heart by faith with thanksgiving, So you can read in a transubstantiation view. You can read in what's called a receptionist view. I'm receiving it, even though this substance has not changed. I think this fits in rather well with the fact that it's a mystery. I mean, fundamentally, it's not something that we can understand, and it is a very difficult teaching. Jesus is teaching on this. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, right? And people left him because of this. This was a hard teaching. I think it remains a hard teaching, and in humility, I think the best thing we can do is say, he is really present in the Eucharist. How? It's a mystery.
I appreciate that answer more than most of what I get, because so much of when you talk to people on one of the two sides is essentially when you take the communion or the Eucharist in those traditions, you are purposely submitting yourself to their interpretation of what it is. And I don't like that, especially when you do regard it as a mystery. I mean, Catholics are a little bit more sensitive to the mysteries in general, but this is one of the things where they do not make any sort of excuses. Right. I mean, I know Catholics who genuinely get emotionally unwell when they haven't been able to partake in the Eucharist for long periods of time. So they do not allow any interpretational liberalism on that. And while I definitely think that I like that answer a lot more than the one I tend to get, especially when the alternative is there's no real meaning to it beyond being as a memorial to it. I like that answer.
Well, he didn't say. I mean, when it comes down to now we're in the realm of my opinion rather than what the Church particularly teaches. You'll see that there's a lot of latitude for what exactly you think, but it's not just a memorial because he says, this is my body. If it were just a memorial, he would not have said that. And I think that there's quite a lot that can be gleaned symbolically if you do not read it as just a memorial. What are you doing when you eat this? It is building up your body, right? When you eat this and drink this, it is going into your body to nourish your body. He is feeding you. Right? This isn't just a memorial. This is, yes, the Romans may get emotionally unwell if they don't have the Eucharist. I get emotionally unwell if I don't have the Eucharist because I'm not being fed, right? We believe in the sacrament, right? So in that sense, it's doing something. The Anglican definition that you'll see commonly of what is a sacrament, it's an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. It's a manner that he feeds me by grace, And so it's more than just a memorial. And if he says that the vehicle of that grace is his body, I can buy that. I can't ever exactly put my finger on that, but I can certainly buy it when he says it. This is my body. This is my blood. So another thing too is that the big tentness of Anglicanism, theologically speaking, kind of allows you to hold, follow me on this a little bit. You hold the diamond in your hand, and the diamond has lots of facets in it. And so you see this facet and you think, that's beautiful, that's right. And then you turn it and you see the next facet and you think, that's beautiful, that's also right. And it's both, or it's all three, or it's all five, or however many it is. It actually is all of those things. So the Eucharist is a sacrifice in the sense that it is it is the reflection of Christ's giving of his body and blood on the cross. When he says, this is my body given for you, right? He means that, and it is a foreshadowing directly of his sacrifice on the cross. Okay, and so you have that element of it. That's beautiful and true. And so when the priest gets up there and offers the bread and wine and says the prayer of consecration, you can easily have that image in mind, right? Of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. It's this sacrifice that we are tapping into, this full, perfect, and sufficient sacrifice that we are tapping into when we consecrate the elements, right? That's one element. That's good and true and beautiful. And then you turn the thing and you think, okay, well, another take on this is that this is a family meal. This is the disciples gathered around the table. This is an altar, but it's also a table, right? And he's feeding us by grace. Well, it's a sacrifice. Christ has sacrificed himself once, and we are tapping into that sacrifice, but we call it the Eucharist, and Eucharist means thanksgiving. It's a thanksgiving sacrifice. We are coming together, assembling in order to give thanks for this gift of his body and blood. It's that too. And I think Anglicans are very comfortable doing the turning of the diamond thing. It's not just one facet of that diamond. It's the whole thing. How can it be the whole thing? It's a mystery.
Well, there you go. I think we're rapidly approaching the hour mark, but do you want to wrap up anything specific, or do you just want to shout out your social media stuff and your projects online?
Oh, let's see. Well, Well, yeah, I realized that this we covered kind of a lot of ground. Anglicanism is a history with a really long tradition, and I don't mean to put too much emphasis on the fact that some of it is in disarray, but with a tradition that is as long as ours, I guarantee you there has always been some disarray. So what I can suggest, if anybody is interested in this, is to check out the Book of Common Prayer. That would be one thing I would suggest. And you can Google the scriptural BCP, which is my resource to visualize the biblical citations for this. If you're looking for, how to pray or, more on this book, that's something I would suggest. Let's see. We're not always in such disarray. There's many things that we can offer that I think that our branch of the church cultivates for the good of the entire body of Christ, which is the universal church. So you don't have, there's no impulse. You don't have to go and become an Anglican. But I think, as you say, the C.S. Lewises of the world, the T.S. Eliots of the world are definitely gifts. And I think we're very proud of those people. Yes, check out the Book of Common Prayer. You can follow me on Twitter if you like, although there's not, it's not incredibly interesting, but you can if you like. It's just Arlie Coles. That's it.
Or you can go on Spencer Clavin's locals page and watch us kind of throw articles at one another and kind of, because we usually correspond to each other's comments. So
yes,
but yeah, this was a very enlightening conversation. I appreciate you kind of coming on and discussing this. I feel like we could probably do other conversations just on the AI and the state of the other stuff, but I realize you have to head out shortly, so Thanks so much for coming on. It was great talking with you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Sure. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions podcast. Editing, producing, and hosting are by Tyler Hummel, artwork by Crystal Cowley, and original music was composed by Melissa Lafira and the late Dan Smolla. Like, subscribe, and please let us know what you think about the show in the comments below if you'd like to see anyone interesting be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.